The fluorescent lights of the Family Feud studio blazed overhead as Patricia Lee smoothed down her blue cardigan for what felt like the 100th time. At 52, she'd spent most of her adult life surrounded by the quiet comfort of books at the Riverside Public Library, where the loudest sounds were usually the rustle of turning pages or the occasional whispered question about the Dewey Decimal System. This, the cameras, the audience, the impossibly white teeth of Steve Harvey standing just a few feet away, was as far from her comfort zone as she could imagine. All right, all right, all right. Steve's voice boomed across the stage, his signature energy filling every corner of the studio. We've got the Lee family from Sacramento, California, going up against the Martinez family from Houston, Texas. Now, before we get started, I always like to know a little something about our contestants. Patricia, you're the team captain. Tell me about yourself. Patricia's mouth went dry. She glanced toward the audience, where her son Daniel sat in the third row, his noise-canceling headphones around his neck, his hands fidgeting with the edge of his favorite Spider-Man t-shirt. At 17, he rarely made eye contact with strangers, but he'd insisted on coming today. Her sister Margaret sat beside him, ready to help if he needed to step out. I'm a librarian, Patricia began, her voice barely carrying. I've worked at the same library for 26 years. 26 years, Steve repeated, his eyebrows shooting up in that expressive way that had become his trademark. That's amazing. That's dedication right there, ladies and gentlemen. The audience applauded, and Patricia felt her shoulders relax slightly. Now, I gotta ask, you ever have to shush anybody? Give me your best librarian shush. Despite her nerves, Patricia smiled and delivered a stern show. That made Steve jump back dramatically. Oh no, 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 he exclaimed, clutching his chest. I felt that in my soul. That's the sound of every time I got in trouble in school. The audience laughed, and Patricia found herself laughing too. There was something about Steve Harvey's warmth that made even the brightest spotlight feel a little less intimidating. So, Patricia, Steve continued, his tone shifting to something gentler, you got family here supporting you today? Patricia's eyes found Daniel again. Yes, my son Daniel is in the audience. How old is Daniel? 17. Steve's face lit up. 17. Man, that's a great age. Terrible age too, but great. More laughter. I got kids, I know how it is. Tell me, what's your proudest moment as Daniel's mom? What's something that just made your heart swell up? The question landed like a physical weight on Patricia's chest. Around her, the studio seemed to blur at the edges. She hadn't expected this, hadn't prepared for this particular vulnerability. In her peripheral vision, she could see her sister Margaret lean forward slightly, concerned. Patricia opened her mouth to deflect, to say something generic about a good report card or a soccer game, but the words that came out were different. Daniel is autistic, she said quietly, and the studio fell into an attentive hush. He didn't speak for a long time, not a single word until he was 6, and even then, it was just single words here and there. Mama. Book. More. I used to lie awake at night wondering if I'd ever have a real conversation with my son, if I'd ever hear him tell me about his day, or ask me a question, or... Her voice cracked, and she paused, embarrassed by the emotion welling up. Steve Harvey, who moments ago had been all smiles and comedy, stood perfectly still. His expression had transformed into something Patricia had seen in interviews, but never expected to experience firsthand. Complete, undivided empathy. He didn't rush her, didn't try to fill the silence with a joke. He just waited. When Daniel was 12, Patricia continued, and now the tears were flowing freely. We were at the library. It was after hours, and I was shelving books. He was sitting in the children's section with this picture book he'd looked at 1,000 times, Where the Wild Things Are. I heard his voice, and at first I thought maybe he was making sounds, you know, the way he sometimes does. But then I realized he was reading. Not just words, but full sentences. Let the wild rumpus start. Over and over again. And then he looked up at me and said, clear as day, Mom, can we go where the wild things are? Patricia pressed her hand to her mouth, trying to hold back the sobs. I stood there in the middle of the library and just cried and cried because my baby had asked me a question. A real question. It was the most beautiful sentence I'd ever heard. The camera operator wiped his eyes. In the audience, people were reaching for tissues. Steve Harvey stood there, one hand on his hip, the other covering his mouth, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "That's beautiful," Steve said softly. "That's really beautiful, Patricia. You know, people don't understand." He paused, gathering himself. They don't understand that the things we take for granted, the simple things, those can be the biggest miracles for some families. You're a strong woman. Daniel is blessed to have you. Patricia nodded, unable to speak, and dabbed at her eyes with a tissue someone from production had quickly provided. "All right," Steve said, taking a deep breath and clapping his hands together, clearly trying to regain his composure. "All right, we got a game to play. And I'm already crying, and we haven't even started. Patricia, you ready?" "I'm ready," Patricia managed, though her voice still trembled. "Let's do this. Patricia, come on up to the podium." The game began in earnest. The first question appeared on the board. Name something people do when they're nervous. Patricia buzzed in first. "Fidget with their hands. Fidget with their hands," Steve repeated, pointing at the board. The number one answer flipped over, and the Lee family erupted in cheers. "Good answer. Good answer," her cousin Robert shouted from beside her at the family podium. They played through several rounds, the Lee family showing surprising competitiveness. Patricia found herself getting into the rhythm of the game, the earlier emotional moment fading into focused determination. Steve worked the crowd expertionally, throwing in his signature reactions, the bug-eyed stare at ridiculous answers, the slow walk away from the podium when someone said something outrageous, the way he'd look directly into the camera with an expression that said, "Can you believe this?" When her nephew Tyler answered, "Chicken," to the question, "Name something that's hard to catch," and it wasn't on the board, Steve's reaction was priceless. He stared at Tyler for a long moment, then turned to the audience with his arms spread wide. "Chicken. Have you ever tried to catch a chicken? That's actually a good." He stopped himself, looking back at the board. "But it ain't up there." The Martinez family was equally entertaining, and the game was close. As they approached the final round, fast money, the Lee family was ahead by just 40 points. "Patricia," Steve said as they set up for fast money, "if your family wins today, what are you going to do with the money?" Patricia didn't hesitate. "There's a special summer camp for kids on the autism spectrum. It's expensive, but Daniel's been wanting to go for 2 years. The money would cover it." Steve nodded slowly. "Then let's get you that money. Robert, you ready?" Robert played first, answering the 5 questions quickly. He scored 187 points, a decent total, but they'd need Patricia to bring in at least 13 more to reach the winning 200. As Robert was escorted backstage so he couldn't hear Patricia's answers, Steve turned to Patricia. "You feeling good?" "Nervous," she admitted. "That's all right. Nervous is good. Nervous means you care. You got this." There was something in his voice, a genuine encouragement that transcended the show's format. This wasn't just Steve Harvey the host. This was Steve Harvey the father, the person who'd spoken openly about his own struggles and faith. The fast money round began. Patricia answered quickly, her librarian's mind processing and retrieving information efficiently. When the last answer was revealed, Steve tallied the points. "You got 42 points, Patricia. That gives your family a total of 229. You won." The Lee family rushed the stage, hugging and celebrating. Confetti cannons went off. The Martinez family applauded sportingly from their side. Steve shook everyone's hands, congratulating them, his genuine happiness for their win evident in every gesture. $20,000. Steve announced. "Patricia, you're sending Daniel to that camp." As the celebration continued, something shifted in the audience. Steve was in the middle of his closing remarks when he noticed movement in the third row. Daniel had stood up. Margaret reached for him, but he gently moved her hand away. He was looking directly at the stage, directly at his mother. The audience members nearby noticed and fell quiet. That silence rippled outward like a wave, until even Steve stopped mid-sentence, following everyone's gaze. Daniel was walking toward the stage. Patricia saw him, and her hand flew to her mouth. "Daniel." Security moved forward instinctively, but Steve held up a hand, stopping them. Something told him this was important. The studio was now completely silent except for the sound of Daniel's sneakers on the carpeted aisle. Daniel reached the edge of the stage, and one of the crew members helped him up the stairs. He walked across the bright floor, past all the cameras and lights and people, until he stood directly in front of his mother. His hands were still fidgeting, and he wasn't quite making eye contact, his gaze fixed somewhere around her shoulder, but he was there. He was there, in front of hundreds of people, in front of cameras broadcasting to millions. Patricia couldn't breathe. She'd never seen Daniel in a space like this, with this many people, this much stimulation. He should be overwhelmed. He should be covering his ears, seeking the quiet room Margaret had been told about during the pre-show briefing. But instead, he was standing here, in the middle of everything. Daniel's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. Patricia could see the effort, the concentration, the bravery it took for him to push past whatever barriers existed between his thoughts and his voice. "Mom," he said, and the word carried in the silent studio like a bell. His voice was deeper than it had been at 12, colored by the changes of adolescence, but it had that same clarity that had made her cry in the library 5 years ago. Patricia's tears started fresh. "Yes, baby." Daniel's eyes flickered to hers for just a moment, then away again. But his hand reached out and found hers, held it tight. "I love you." For words. His second full sentence ever spoken to her. Not read from a book. Not repeated from a video he'd watched 100 times. Original. Spontaneous. His. Patricia's knees nearly buckled. She pulled Daniel into a hug, and he let her, even though hugs were usually difficult for him. She felt his arms wrap around her, felt him rest his head against her shoulder. The studio erupted. It wasn't applause, it was something bigger than that. It was the sound of hundreds of hearts breaking and healing simultaneously. Audience members were on their feet, crying openly. The Martinez family was crying. The crew was crying. The stone-faced security guard who'd helped Daniel onto the stage was wiping his eyes. And Steve Harvey, the man who'd made a career out of quick comebacks and perfect timing, stood with tears streaming down his face, completely wordless. He looked at the cameras, then away, then back at Patricia and Daniel, then at the audience. He opened his mouth several times as if to speak, but nothing came out. Finally, he just shook his head, pulled out his pocket square, and dabbed at his eyes. He started, then stopped. Laughed. Cried. Tried again. "I've been doing this show for a long time. A long time. And I've seen some beautiful moments. But this." He gestured toward Patricia and Daniel, still locked in their embrace. "This is everything. This is what it's all about." He walked over to them, placed a gentle hand on Daniel's shoulder. Daniel didn't flinch away. "Daniel," Steve said softly, "that was the bravest thing I've ever seen on this stage. You know that? The bravest thing. Thank you for sharing that with us." Daniel didn't respond verbally, but he gave a small nod, and for Steve Harvey, that was enough. The show went to commercial, but no one moved. Patricia held her son, and Daniel let himself be held, and the moment stretched out in the bright lights of the studio, perfect and unscripted and real. When they finally broke apart, Daniel looked exhausted but also somehow lighter. Margaret had made her way to the stage, and Daniel gravitated toward her, ready for some quiet after his moment of incredible courage. "You okay?" Margaret asked him. "I'm okay," Daniel said, which made Margaret's eyes widen. A full sentence, unprompted, in response to a question. She looked at Patricia, who could only smile through her tears. Steve gathered himself, straightened his tie, and addressed the audience. "I tell you what, folks. This job, this show, I love it because you never know what's going to happen. You never know when you're going to witness something that reminds you what really matters in life." He turned to Patricia. "You asked me earlier what I thought about your proudest moment. I'm going to tell you what I think. I think Daniel didn't just speak that sentence in the library 5 years ago. He's been speaking to you every day since then in all the ways he knows how. And today, he chose to speak in a way the whole world could hear. That's not just your proud moment. That's his too. He wanted everyone to know how much he loves his mama." Patricia nodded, unable to form words. "And that camp you're sending him to? That's going to be amazing." But you know what? Something tells me Daniel's going to do amazing things, camp or no camp, because he's got something that can't be taught. He's got courage. He's got love. And he's got a mama who never gave up on him, not for 1 second. The audience applauded again, and this time it felt different, not just celebration, but reverence. Respect for the journey they'd glimpsed, the struggles they couldn't fully understand, and the triumph they'd witnessed. As the show wound down and the cameras finally stopped rolling, the studio remained charged with emotion. Other audience members approached Patricia, sharing their own stories. Children with autism, siblings, friends, students. Each story was different, but the thread connecting them all was the same. Love that persists, hope that endures, and the small victories that mean everything. Steve Harvey, who normally left quickly after filming to maintain his schedule, stayed. He sat with the Lee family in the green room, asking about Daniel's interests, learning about his love for Spider-Man and space and ancient Egypt. Daniel didn't say much, but he showed Steve his favorite app on his phone, a constellation tracker, and Steve listened with genuine interest. You know, Steve said, looking at the virtual stars on Daniel's screen, my grandfather used to take me outside at night and teach me about constellations. Said every star had a story. He glanced at Patricia, then back at Daniel. I think he was right. Everyone's got a story. And Daniel, you just told yours in the most powerful way possible. Before they left, Steve pulled Patricia aside. I want you to have my direct contact, he said, scribbling on a piece of paper. I'm serious about this. You ever need anything, advice, resources, just someone to talk to who gets it, you call me. My wife Marjorie and I, we work with a lot of youth programs. We know people who specialize in helping kids like Daniel. You don't have to do this alone. Patricia looked at the paper, then at Steve, this man she'd only known for a few hours, but who had somehow become a part of one of the most important days of her life. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for stopping. Thank you for making space for that moment. Another host might have. Another host would have missed the most important thing that happened on that stage today. Steve interrupted gently. That wasn't about the game. That was about something bigger. That was about a son telling his mother he loves her in a room full of strangers because he wanted the whole world to know. You don't rush that. You don't cut to commercial. You let that moment be what it needs to be. As the Lee family packed up to leave, Daniel turned back to look at the stage one more time. Patricia watched him, wondering what he was thinking, what he was feeling. She'd spent so many years trying to interpret his silences, to understand the thoughts he couldn't express. Today, he'd given her a gift, not just the words themselves, but the willingness to push past every barrier, every fear, every overwhelm, to make sure she heard them. On the drive home, Margaret drove while Patricia sat in the back with Daniel. He had his headphones on now, playing the music he loved, but his hand rested on the seat between them, and Patricia held it. Daniel, she said softly, what you did today was incredibly brave. He looked at her, really looked at her, and for a moment his hand tightened around hers. I practiced, he said. Patricia's heart clenched. You practiced? With Aunt Margaret. For 3 weeks. Every day after school. He paused, processing, organizing his thoughts into words. I wanted to say it right. I wanted everyone to know. Tears rolled down Patricia's cheeks. 3 weeks. Her son had spent 3 weeks preparing, practicing, pushing himself to do something terrifying so he could tell her he loved her in front of the world. You said it perfectly, Patricia told him. Absolutely perfectly. When the episode aired 6 weeks later, the moment went viral within hours. The clip of Daniel standing, walking to the stage, and speaking those 4 words was shared millions of times across every social media platform. News outlets picked it up. Mental health advocates shared it. Autism awareness organizations used it in their campaigns. But what struck Patricia most was the messages. Thousands upon thousands of messages from parents of children with autism, from autistic adults, from teachers and therapists, and siblings and friends. Each one carried the same theme. Thank you for showing us. Thank you for letting us see. Thank you for reminding us what matters. One message came from a mother in Ohio whose 7-year-old son was nonverbal. I've been so focused on waiting for him to speak that I forgot to see all the ways he already tells me he loves me," she wrote. "Your story reminded me to celebrate what is, not just wait for what might be." Another came from a young man in his 20s who'd been diagnosed with autism as a child. "I'm verbal now, but I remember how hard it was to get words out, how much effort it took. Seeing Daniel do that, seeing him push through to tell you what you needed to hear, that's hero stuff. Tell him an internet stranger is proud of him." Steve Harvey shared the clip on his own social media with a caption that read, "In my years of hosting Family Feud, I've learned that the best moments can't be scripted. They happen when real people show real courage and real love." Daniel and Patricia Lee reminded all of us what matters most. Thank you for that gift. Patricia framed that post and hung it in the library's break room, where she ate lunch every day. She'd returned to work the week after the show aired, and at first, she'd been worried about the attention. But her colleagues, her patrons, even the teenagers who came in after school, they all understood. They'd always known Patricia was devoted to Daniel, but now they'd seen why. And they'd seen what that devotion had created, a young man who, despite every obstacle, had found a way to express the deepest truth of his heart. The money from Family Feud did send Daniel to camp that summer, and he thrived there. He made friends. He learned to kayak. He participated in a talent show where he recited every constellation in the Northern Hemisphere from memory, earning a standing ovation from counselors and campers alike. But more than that, something had shifted in Daniel after the show. He still struggled with communication. He still needed his routines, his quiet spaces, his time to process the overwhelming world around him. But he also seemed more willing to try, more ready to push at the edges of his comfort zone. He started a small YouTube channel where he talked about space and ancient civilizations. And while his delivery was sometimes halting and he didn't always make eye contact with the camera, his knowledge and passion shone through. He found his community there, other people who loved what he loved, who didn't care about eye contact or perfect social cues, who just wanted to talk about Jupiter's moons or the construction of the pyramids. A year after the show, Patricia received an invitation to speak at an autism awareness conference. The organizers had seen the Family Feud episode and wanted her perspective as a parent. She almost declined. Public speaking had never been her strength, but Daniel encouraged her. "Tell them," he said simply. "Tell them about the library." So she did. She told a room full of parents, educators, and advocates about that day in the library, about the years of silence and single words, about the moment her son asked her a question and changed her world. She told them about Family Feud, about Steve Harvey's kindness, about Daniel's courage. But mostly, she told them what she'd learned, that love doesn't wait for perfect communication, that victory doesn't always look like what you expected, that sometimes the proudest moments come not when your child conquers the world, but when they conquer their own fear to tell you something you already knew but needed to hear. "I knew Daniel loved me," Patricia told the audience. "I knew it in the way he'd bring me his favorite books to read, even though he'd already memorized them. I knew it in the way he'd reach for my hand in crowded places. I knew it in 1,000 small ways every single day. But when he said those words on that stage, it wasn't really for me. It was for him. He needed to say it. He needed to push past everything that makes speaking hard and claim that moment. That was his victory, not mine. I was just blessed to witness it." The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes. In the back of the room, Steve Harvey watched through a video call, having asked the organizers to let him tune in remotely. When Patricia finished, he sent her a text. "You're doing it. You're helping people see. Proud of you." That night, at home in their small house filled with books and star maps and Daniel's carefully organized collections, Patricia found her son in his room, working on a new video about the Andromeda Galaxy. "How was the conference?" he asked, not looking up from his computer. "It was good. Scary but good." "Like the show?" Patricia smiled. "Yeah, baby. Like the show." Daniel saved his work and swiveled in his chair to face her. He still didn't quite meet her eyes, his gaze landing somewhere around her chin, but his expression was focused, present. "Mom," he said, "I'm going to say it again." "Say what?" "What I said at the show? I'm going to practice saying it more." so it gets easier. So I can say it whenever I want. Patricia's throat tightened. Okay. Daniel took a breath. That same visible effort she'd seen on the Family Feud stage, the marshaling of will and courage and determination. I love you. I love you too, baby. I know, Daniel said, and there was something that might have been a smile at the corner of his mouth. But I wanted to say it anyway. And in that moment, in their quiet house far from studio lights and cameras and audiences, Patricia understood what Steve Harvey had seen that day on stage. This wasn't just about a son telling his mother he loved her. It was about claiming voice, about choosing courage, about deciding that some things are worth the struggle to express. Every day after that, Daniel practiced. Sometimes it came out smoothly. Sometimes he had to try 3 or 4 times. Sometimes he'd texted instead because the words wouldn't form. But he kept trying, kept pushing, kept growing. And every time, no matter how it was delivered, Patricia heard it the same way she'd heard it that first time in the library, the same way she'd heard it on the Family Feud stage, as the most beautiful sentence in the world. Years later, when Daniel was in college studying astrophysics, when he'd learned to navigate the world in his own unique way, when he'd found love and purpose and community, he would sometimes think back to that day on Family Feud. He'd remember the lights, the noise, the overwhelming sensation of too much everything. He'd remember seeing his mother on that stage, crying as she talked about him, and feeling something rise up in his chest, something urgent and important and necessary. He'd remember standing up, walking forward, and speaking those 4 words that had taken him 17 years to say and 3 weeks to prepare. And he'd remember Steve Harvey's face, the way the host had stopped everything, had made space for something unscripted and raw and true. In a world that often moved too fast, that demanded quick responses and smooth interactions, Steve had given him time, had let the moment be what it needed to be. Daniel would carry that lesson forward, that the best things in life, love, connection, understanding, can't be rushed. They come in their own time, in their own way, and the people who matter most are the ones who wait for you, who make space for you, who see your effort even when the words don't come easily. On the wall of his college dorm room, Daniel kept a photo from that day. Him and his mother on the Family Feud stage, wrapped in an embrace, while Steve Harvey stood nearby with his hand over his heart. It wasn't a perfect photo. Daniel's face was half hidden, his mother was crying, and Steve looked like he might start crying too, but it captured something real. Something that transcended the game show format, the bright lights, the manufactured entertainment. It captured love, courage, connection, the universal human need to be seen and heard and understood. And every time Daniel looked at that photo, every time he remembered that moment, he thought the same thing he'd thought standing on that stage. Some things are worth the effort of saying. Some things need to be spoken out loud, even when it's hard, even when it takes every ounce of courage you possess. Some things, like, I love you, change everything.